In the year 408 AD, the Visigoth king Alaric surrounded Rome and starved it. When the Senate finally begged for terms, he named his price: 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, 4,000 tunics of silk, 3,000 hides dyed scarlet, and 3,000 pounds of black pepper. Not as a joke, not as an afterthought thrown in at the end of a negotiation. Pepper was written into the ransom of the greatest city in the world, in a list drawn up by a man who had spent 2 years learning exactly what Rome had, and exactly what it could not refuse to give. The Byzantine historian Zosimus preserved those terms, and they have the specific, unembellished quality of a bill of lading. Not a legend, a receipt. We tend to hear that and laugh. Pepper. The thing in the shaker on the table, the thing you stop noticing. But the Goths outside the walls were not confused, and they were not making a point. They asked for pepper because pepper was money, storable, portable, universally accepted, and, sitting in warehouses on the far side of the Tiber by the ton, Rome paid its ransom out of the pantry. And to understand why, you have to understand how a jar of black seeds from the other side of the world ended up being worth a barbarian army's time. Alaric did not appear out of nowhere. He had been circling the Western Empire for 15 years, sometimes as an enemy, sometimes as an imperial officer, usually as both, depending on who in Ravenna was paying him and how recently. What he wanted was not the destruction of Rome. He wanted land for his people, a command, and grain. He had asked for it repeatedly and been refused or bribed or ignored. To understand the depth of that grievance, you have to go back 30 years to the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, when a Gothic army destroyed a Roman force and killed the Emperor Valens in the field. That single afternoon ended Rome's ability to simply expel the Goths from its territory. From that point forward, they had to be managed, settled, incorporated. Alaric grew up in that world, a Gothic leader who had served inside Roman armies, who understood the empire's machinery, and who had watched it repeatedly refuse to honor its own promises. The man who managed him in these later years was Stilicho, half Vandal, the most capable soldier in the West, the effective ruler of the empire in all but name. Stilicho understood Alaric because he had fought him, beaten him, and then negotiated with him. He kept the Goths at arm's length through a mix of gold and threat, and it worked. In August of 408, the court at Ravenna turned on him. Stilicho was accused of conspiring with the barbarians, the standard charge against anyone in Rome with a foreign name, and he was executed. Then the empire did something far more consequential than killing its best general. Across Italy, imperial troops turned on the families of the Gothic soldiers serving in the Roman army. Wives and children were massacred in the garrison towns. The men in those units, by the ancient count, some 30,000 of them, did the only thing left to do. They walked out of the Roman army and into Alaric's camp. In a single summer, Rome executed the one man who knew how to handle Alaric, and then handed Alaric 30,000 trained soldiers who had personal reasons to want Italy to suffer. When the Goths crossed the Alps that autumn, there was no field army left to stop them. There was only the wall. Alaric did not assault the walls, he didn't need to. Rome in 408 was a city of several 100,000 people that grew almost none of its own food. Grain came up the Tiber from Portus, the great harbour at the river's mouth that Claudius and Trajan had built to feed the city. Alaric took Portus, sat down and closed the road. The rations were cut to half, then to a third. Then the grain stopped moving at all. What follows in the sources is the ordinary arithmetic of a starving city. Prices ran past what anyone could pay. Bodies were not carried out for burial because the gates were shut. So they stayed inside the walls, and disease did what disease does in a crowded city in winter. The ancient accounts include the claim that some Romans turned to eating human flesh, a charge that appears so routinely in siege literature that it tells you more about the genre than about Rome. Meanwhile, in Ravenna, the imperial court did essentially nothing. This is the part that gets lost. The Emperor Honorius was not in the city. The capital of the Western Empire had moved to Ravenna 6 years earlier. Safer, marsh-protected, easier to defend. He was in no danger, and he sent no army. Rome was not an empire brought to its knees. Rome was a city abandoned by its own government and left to negotiate for itself. So the Senate did. It sent an embassy out through the gate to ask the barbarian what he wanted. By one account, they tried to bluff him, warned him that the people inside were armed and many. Alaric is supposed to have laughed and said the thicker the grass, the easier it is to cut. Then he named his price. Here is the question nobody asks about that ransom. Gold makes sense, silver makes sense. Silk and dyed leather are portable luxury goods an army can sell anywhere. But pepper? To answer that, you have to follow the pepper backwards. And if you've seen our video on the history of the spice trade, you already know how far back it goes. Black pepper does not grow anywhere near Rome. It grows on the Malabar Coast in southwest India, and in the 1st centuries AD, it reached the Mediterranean by one of the most impressive logistical routes the ancient world ever ran. The primary port on the Indian side was Muziris, a city so central to this trade that it appears in Roman contracts, Egyptian papyri, and the Tamil poems of the Sangam period. Pepper left Muziris, crossed the Indian Ocean, and entered the Roman world. The mechanics of that crossing were documented in a 1st century Greek merchant's handbook called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, essentially a sailing manual and trade directory for the routes between Egypt and India. Ships left Egypt's Red Sea ports and rode the summer monsoon east, not creeping along the coastline, but crossing open ocean, a passage of roughly 40 days, time to a wind that reverses twice a year. They loaded pepper in India and rode the winter monsoon home. Cargo went overland to the Nile, downriver to Alexandria, and across the Mediterranean into Italy. An entire industrial-scale trade, running on a wind schedule, thousands of miles each way. And here's what surprises people. By 408, it had worked so well for so long that pepper wasn't really a luxury anymore. Rome had warehouses for it. The Emperor Domitian built the Heraea Piperataria, the pepper warehouses in the heart of the city, 3 centuries before Alaric arrived. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, complained that the spice trade was draining Roman gold eastward by the hundreds of millions of sesterces annually, which tells you something important. This was not a trickle of exotic goods. This was a trade large enough to alarm a Roman senator about the balance of payments. You do not build a dedicated warehouse district, and you do not write fiscal warnings into natural history encyclopedias for something that comes in by the ounce. You build it for volume. That is the whole answer. Pepper wasn't on the ransom list because it was precious and rare. It was on the list because it was the opposite. Abundant enough to exist in bulk, stable enough to store for years, valuable enough per pound to be worth hauling, and accepted by everyone from Britain to Syria. It was, functionally, money. A commodity currency sitting in Roman warehouses by the ton. Alaric was not asking for seasoning. He was asking for £3,000 of a liquid asset. And the Senate, which had no field army and no emperor coming to help, had it on hand. So Rome paid. The gold, the silver, the silk, the hides, the pepper, hauled out through the gates in the winter of 408. And the title on this video says, "The Ransom Saved an Empire." Here is the honest version. It bought about 18 months. Alaric lifted the blockade and withdrew. What he actually wanted was never the treasure. It was a settlement, land, a legitimate command. He kept asking Ravenna for it. Ravenna kept refusing because Honorius, safe in his marshes, had no incentive to negotiate with a man who had already been paid. So Alaric came back. He besieged Rome a second time in 409, and this time installed his own emperor in the city, a puppet meant to force Ravenna's hand. That failed too. In August of 410, he came back a third time, and the gates opened. For 3 days, the Goths sacked the city. Rome had not fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years, and the shock of it rippled across the Mediterranean, as men wrote from as far as Bethlehem and Africa, trying to make sense of what it meant that the eternal city had been taken. Alaric himself died within months before he ever got the land he had spent his life asking for. The ransom didn't save Rome. It delayed the sack of Rome, which is not the same thing. But it left behind something worth keeping, a written record, preserved by Zosimus in a bureaucrat's list of goods, of the moment when a barbarian army and a Roman Senate both agreed, without needing to discuss it, that £3,000 of pepper was a serious sum of money.